They didn't just kick me out of the family. If that's all it had been, maybe I could have handled it. A packed bag, a slammed door, a painful but clean break. But that's not what happened. They erased me. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind that used to feel safe. Family dinners were tradition in our house. No matter how busy or irritated anyone was, we showed up. We sat around my Uncle Richard's long oak table, pretending we were closer than we really were. That night, the room felt different. Everyone was already seated when I arrived. No greetings, no jokes, just silence that pressed against my chest the moment I stepped inside. "Sit down," my uncle said. "Not please. Not we need to talk. Just sit down." The chair scraped loudly as I pulled it out. My aunt stared at her folded hands. My cousins wouldn't look at me. And my uncle leaned back in his chair like a man who'd already made up his mind. "We're missing money," he said. I laughed softly, confused more than amused. "That's not possible," I said. "I don't even handle." "You had access," he interrupted. That single sentence changed everything. Suddenly, every late night I'd worked became suspicious. Every time I'd questioned a decision became defiance. They twisted curiosity into guilt and painted me as a problem they'd tolerated for too long. I tried to explain. I really did. But the more I spoke, the clearer it became that no one was listening. They didn't ask for proof. They didn't ask questions. They didn't want the truth. They wanted someone to blame. My uncle stood up slowly, the way powerful people do when they know the room belongs to them. "This family is built on trust," he said. "And right now, we can't trust you." I looked around the table, waiting for someone to speak up. Someone who knew me. Someone who'd grown up with me. No one did. That hurt more than the accusation itself. "You're no longer welcome here," my uncle said. The words landed quietly, but their weight crushed something inside me. I stood up without arguing, without begging. Pride was the only thing I had left, and I wasn't about to lose that too. As I walked toward the door, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. They didn't want me gone temporarily. They wanted me forgotten. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and just like that, I stopped belonging. They thought this was the end of my story. They were wrong. One day, I would return. And when I did, they wouldn't recognize the person standing in front of them. The city didn't care that I'd been erased. That was the first thing I learned. It didn't care about family dinners or broken trust or the fact that I'd walked out of a house that night with nowhere to go. The streets kept moving. Cars honked. People laughed. Life went on, indifferent to the weight pressing down on my chest. I slept on a friend's couch the first night. Then another. Then eventually, the unspoken tension told me it was time to move on. Hospitality has limits, especially when you don't know how long you'll need it. I found a cheap room on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the lock felt more symbolic than secure. I didn't complain. I was grateful to have a door that's still open for me. Work came next, whatever I could find. Night shifts, warehouse jobs, cleaning offices after hours. I learned how exhausting it is to be invisible, how easy it is for people to look through you when they don't need anything from you. There were moments I thought about going back, about apologizing for something I didn't do, just to make the discomfort stop, about asking my uncle to reconsider, about convincing myself that maybe I'd been wrong. But every time I imagined walking back into that house, I remembered the silence, the way no one defended me, the way they'd already moved on before I even reached the door. So I stayed gone. The hardest part wasn't the lack of money. It was the nights. The long, quiet hours when exhaustion wore off and thoughts crept in. Doubt has a voice, and it gets louder when you're alone. It asked questions I didn't want to answer. It reminded me of everything I'd lost. But somewhere in that loneliness, something else began to grow. Anger didn't explode inside me. It settled, became focused, cold. I started paying attention to how systems worked, to why some people always seemed to land on their feet while others didn't. I noticed how often failure followed the same patterns, how chaos wasn't random. It was usually the result of bad decisions made by people who never expected consequences. I began reading after work. Not out of ambition at first, but distraction. Finance articles. Business breakdowns. Stories of collapse and recovery. One night turned into many. Many turned into habit. Slowly, the shame I carried began to change shape. It stopped feeling like a weight and started feeling like fuel. I wasn't planning revenge. Not yet. I wasn't planning anything at all. But I made myself a quiet promise during one of those sleepless nights. I would never again let someone else decide my worth. And whatever came next, however long it took, I would be ready. I didn't wake up one day with a plan. There was no dramatic promise. No moment where I clenched my fists and swore revenge into the dark. What changed was quieter than that. It started with noticing things. While stacking boxes at work, I noticed how supervisors talked when they thought no one important was listening. While cleaning offices at night, I noticed how success left fingerprints, patterns repeated in every building, every company, every failure. Nothing was random. People failed for the same reasons over and over. And the people who paid the price were rarely the ones responsible. That thought stayed with me. Late at night, when exhaustion wore off, my mind replayed the family meeting. Not the words, the structure of it. Who spoke? Who stayed silent? Who already knew the outcome before I walked in? And then it hit me. They didn't blame me because I was guilty. They blamed me because I was convenient. I was young, replaceable, outside the real circle of power. That wasn't cruelty. That was strategy. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I stopped reading for distraction and started reading for answers. Finance articles. Business failures. Legal breakdowns. I didn't understand everything at first, but I noticed something important. Money wasn't the source of power. Information was. Leverage was. Protection came from being necessary. Balance sheets stopped looking like numbers and started telling stories. Stories about fear. About ego. About companies pretending to be strong while quietly bleeding underneath. And that's when something uncomfortable surfaced. My family's business, the one they treated like a fortress, was fragile. It always had been. Too much trust. Too little oversight. Too many decisions made on reputation instead of verification. The same trust they claimed I'd betrayed. That realization didn't make me smile. It made me careful. I didn't talk about it. I didn't share theories. I learned how to stay quiet, how to listen, how to let people underestimate me without correcting them. That turned out to be useful. I changed jobs, took positions that taught me more than they paid, learned how negotiations really worked, how people agreed without committing, how contracts quietly shifted power long before money ever changed hands. Slowly, my life stabilized. Not enough to feel safe, but enough to see forward. And with that clarity came a decision, not spoken aloud, not written down. I didn't want revenge. I wanted immunity. I wanted to become someone who couldn't be erased. And once that seed took root, everything else began to grow around it. Change didn't announce itself. There was no milestone, no moment where I suddenly felt different. If anything, the transformation was boring, repetitive, quiet, easy to miss from the outside. That's why it worked. I woke up earlier, not out of motivation, but necessity. I stayed later, asked fewer questions out loud, and answered more in my head. I started treating every job like training instead of punishment. Most people complained. I observed. I watched who got promoted and who stayed stuck. Not who worked the hardest, but who became difficult to replace. The people who understood systems lasted longer than the ones who relied on effort alone. So I followed that path. I moved jobs again, then again. Each move looked sideways, sometimes even backward, but each one taught me something new. Contracts, risk, people's blind spots. I learned how confidence often covered ignorance, and how silence made people reveal more than they intended. At night, I studied failures. Companies that collapsed overnight. Partnerships that ended quietly. Legal battles buried in paperwork instead of headlines. Every story followed a pattern, warning signs ignored until it was too late. The same patterns I'd seen in my family. That realization stayed with me. Not as anger, As awareness, I started tracking my progress. Skills learned, contacts made, mistakes I wouldn't repeat. I stopped chasing validation. No one was watching anyway. And that freedom was dangerous, in the best way. Months turned into years. My life stabilized. Not comfortably, but predictably. Bills got paid. Stress became manageable. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building. And then something unexpected happened. People started asking for my opinion. At first, it was small things. A coworker asking how I'd handle a client. A manager wanting help with numbers that didn't add up. I kept my answers simple, calm, useful. And I noticed something. People trusted clarity. They trusted someone who didn't sound desperate to be heard. Opportunities followed quietly. Not promotions, access. Meetings I wasn't supposed to be in. Conversations I wasn't meant to hear. Decisions being shaped long before they became official. That's when I understood the difference between power and position. Power moves silently. And by the time it's visible, it's already settled. I didn't rush. I didn't announce progress. I let time do its work. I let people assume whatever made them comfortable. Because the moment you reveal yourself too early, you lose the advantage. And I wasn't ready yet. Some nights, I thought about the family. Not with longing, with distance. They were still operating the same way, trusting the wrong people, ignoring the same risks, assuming loyalty could replace structure. They hadn't changed. I had. And somewhere between those late nights and quiet mornings, I realized something important. The boy they cast out would never survive that table again. But the man I was becoming? He wouldn't need to ask for a seat. The first real break didn't feel dramatic. There was no celebration. No sudden relief. Just a quiet shift, like a door unlocking somewhere I couldn't see yet. I was working on a project no one else wanted. A failing account. Messy records. Clients already halfway out the door. The kind of assignment people accepted only because saying no would look worse. I said yes without hesitation. Not because I was confident, but because I recognized the pattern. The numbers didn't scare me. They told a story. One I'd seen before. Poor oversight. Inflated projections. Trust placed where verification should have been. Fixable. I worked late. Not heroically, methodically. I stripped the problem down to its structure. Cut through assumptions. Rebuilt the plan piece by piece. When the solution worked, no one applauded. But they noticed. The client stayed. The account stabilized. And suddenly, my name started circulating in rooms I wasn't in. That's how progress really happens. Not with announcements, with whispers. More work followed. Slightly better projects. Slightly more responsibility. Nothing flashy. But I had something new now. Leverage. People asked how I thought. Not what I thought, how. That mattered. It meant they weren't just interested in results. They were interested in repeatability. I was becoming useful in a way that lasted. And with usefulness came access. I sat in meetings that weren't on my calendar. Heard executives argue about risks they didn't fully understand. Watched confidence crumble when facts entered the room. I stayed quiet. Listening was still my greatest advantage. Then came the offer. A partner from another firm pulled me aside after a long day. He spoke casually, like he wasn't testing anything. "We could use someone like you," he said. I didn't answer right away. That pause told him everything he needed to know. The move wasn't glamorous. A lateral shift. Slightly better pay. More exposure. More risk. I took it. That decision changed everything. The new firm moved faster. Thought sharper. Less loyalty to tradition. More respect for results. I learned how strategy scaled. How one decision could ripple outward if it was placed correctly. I also learned how fragile reputations really were. One bad quarter. One exposed weakness. And decades of credibility could disappear overnight. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, a familiar name surfaced. My family's company. I didn't look them up. Not yet. But I didn't need to. I knew enough to recognize instability when I saw it. And for the first time since the night I was erased, a dangerous idea took shape. I wouldn't have to go back to them. They would come looking for me. Success didn't arrive all at once. It layered itself slowly, decision by decision, the way real stability does. I stopped measuring progress by money or titles and started measuring it by control. How much of my work depended on me, and how hard it would be to replace. That became the goal. I specialized. Not loudly. Not officially. I positioned myself at the intersection of problems no one wanted responsibility for. Failing deals. Risk exposure. Situations where confidence had run out and clarity was overdue. When things went wrong, people called me quietly. When things went right, they took credit. I didn't mind. Visibility was dangerous before you were ready. I built relationships carefully. Not friendships, trust. The kind based on consistency, not charisma. I learned who followed processes and who followed ego, who verified information and who relied on reputation alone. Patterns never lie. And one pattern became impossible to ignore. Companies didn't collapse because of bad luck. They collapsed because warning signs were ignored, because loyalty replaced accountability, because powerful people believed their position protected them from consequences. I'd seen that before. Late one night, curiosity finally won. I looked them up. My family's company. The surface looked fine. New branding, press releases, confident language. But underneath, the signals were familiar. Overextended credit. Rushed expansion. Leadership that hadn't changed, only aged. Still fragile. I closed the report and didn't think about it again. Not because I was afraid. Because I was patient. Time does more damage than confrontation ever could. I kept building. Took on advisory roles. Sat in rooms where deals were shaped long before announcements were made. Learned how influence worked, not through authority, but through necessity. The more essential I became, the less I needed to speak. Years passed. The boy who walked out with a backpack would have recognized none of this. My life wasn't flashy, but it was controlled, predictable, quietly powerful. Then the signal came. A proposal crossed my desk. Routine at first glance. Mid-sized redevelopment project. Risky timeline. Tight margins. And then I saw the name. Their name. I didn't react. No rush of anger. No satisfaction. Just recognition. This wasn't coincidence. This was gravity. They were reaching outward because they were running out of options. The same way they had years ago, just with better suits and weaker foundations. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know whose desk their future had landed on. I leaned back in my chair and read the proposal again. Slowly. Carefully. This wasn't about revenge. This was about position. And for the first time, the board had shifted. The game I'd been quietly preparing for was finally in front of me. And this time, I would decide how it played out. The email was polite. Too polite. Carefully worded. Professional. Neutral in the way people are when they're asking for help but don't want to admit they need it. They were requesting a meeting. Not demanding one. Not assuming authority. Requesting. I read it twice, not because I needed clarity, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it. Years ago, they decided my place with a sentence spoken across a table. Now they were asking for my time through a carefully drafted message reviewed by legal. Power has a way of reversing itself quietly. They didn't recognize my name. That was obvious. If they had, the email would have sounded different, cautious, maybe even apologetic. Instead, it treated me like any other executive who might be useful. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't respond immediately. Urgency reveals weakness. Silence creates space. I let a day pass. Then another. Long enough for doubt to creep in on their side. Long enough for the situation to feel slightly unstable. Then I replied. Short. Courteous. Non-committal. Happy to discuss. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. I didn't prepare speeches. I didn't rehearse confrontations. This wasn't the moment for emotion. It was the moment for observation. When the day arrived, I arrived early. The building was familiar in the way places from your past sometimes are, altered just enough to feel wrong. New signage. Updated lobby. Same underlying structure. I watched them arrive through the glass walls. My cousin first. Older now. Less confident. His posture carried tension he didn't know how to hide. Then my uncle. Slower. Still composed. Still convinced the world would bend if he stood tall enough. Neither recognized me. Not yet. We exchanged handshakes. Names. Pleasantries. They talked about the project. The challenges. The opportunity. Their words were confident, but their tone betrayed urgency. They needed capital. They needed credibility. They needed a solution that wouldn't expose how close they were to failing. They needed me. And they had no idea. I asked questions. Calm ones. Precise ones. The kind that sounded curious but landed uncomfortably close to truth. I watched my uncle shift in his chair. Watched my cousin glance at him before answering. Some habits never change. As the meeting wrapped up, my uncle smiled. We're optimistic about this partnership, he said. I returned the smile. So am I. They stood. Thanked me. Shook my hand again. Still no recognition. As they left the room, I remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. This wasn't the return. Not yet. This was the opening move. And they had just invited the person they once erased to decide their future. After they left, I didn't move right away. I stayed seated, staring at the empty chairs across the table. The room still carried their presence, urgency disguised as confidence, fear tucked neatly behind rehearsed smiles. They thought the meeting had gone well. That was the advantage. I reviewed my notes slowly, not because I needed them, but because patience had become habit. The fastest way to lose control was to rush toward satisfaction. I wouldn't make that mistake. Over the next few days, information flowed easily. Too easily. They sent documents, projections, internal reports, the kind of transparency people offer when they believe they're dealing with a neutral party. They didn't realize how familiar their weaknesses were. The same shortcuts. The same blind trust. The same optimism unsupported by structure. I didn't judge it. I cataloged it. Every risk they minimized, I highlighted quietly. Every assumption they leaned on, I tested. Their numbers didn't lie, but they didn't tell the whole truth either. And the truth mattered. I assembled my team carefully. Not to impress them, to protect myself. People who asked hard questions. People who didn't care about names or history. People who would challenge me if I was wrong. That's how power stays clean. The second meeting came quickly. Too quickly. That told me pressure was mounting. They needed momentum. Needed to believe this deal was already moving forward. I let them talk again. I always let people talk when they think they're close to winning. My cousin tried to steer the conversation. My uncle anchored it. Same dynamic as before. Same hierarchy. Same unspoken expectation that authority would carry weight. It didn't. When I pushed back gently, the room tightened. Not visibly, but enough to feel. Questions about oversight, about contingency, about accountability. The words made them uncomfortable, and discomfort reveals truth. Afterward, my cousin lingered. You're thorough, he said, attempting a smile. I have to be, I replied. That answer unsettled him more than any accusation would have. That night, I stood in my apartment and looked out at the city. The lights felt different now. Not distant. Not overwhelming. Aligned. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment, timing, position, preparation converging quietly. I thought about the boy who'd walked out years ago with nowhere to go. He would have rushed this moment. Would have wanted recognition, validation, closure. I didn't need any of that. What mattered was outcome. And the outcome was becoming clear. They weren't just asking for help. They were placing themselves within reach. Soon, they would need to choose between pride and survival. And when that choice came, I would be ready to show them the terms. By the third meeting, the tone had changed. They were still polite, still professional, but the confidence they'd arrived with was thinning, worn down by questions they couldn't fully answer and risks they couldn't pretend away. They needed this deal. And now they knew I knew it too. I laid the documents on the table slowly, giving the moment the weight it deserved. Not dramatically, deliberately. I watched my uncle's eyes scan the pages, his jaw tightening just slightly. My cousin leaned forward, already uneasy. "These are revised terms," my uncle said carefully. "Yes," I replied. "Based on the information you provided." Silence followed. The kind that stretches just long enough for anxiety to surface. The terms weren't cruel. They were precise. Equity participation. Operational oversight. Independent audits. Decision thresholds that required approval. Safeguards. The kind of structure that protects an investment and exposes weaknesses. My cousin looked up first. "This is more control than we anticipated." I nodded. That's usually the case when risk is underestimated. My uncle folded his hands together, a familiar gesture. Years ago, that posture had meant final authority. Now it looked like calculation. "We've been operating this company a long time," he said. "We know our business." "I'm sure you do," I replied evenly. "But knowledge and structure aren't the same thing." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were sharp, but because they were true. They asked for time. I gave it to them. Not because I was generous, but because waiting favored me. Days passed. Then a week. Messages grew more frequent, more careful. Their urgency began to leak through the professionalism. I didn't push. Pressure works best when it's internal. When they finally returned, the decision was already written on their faces. "We can accept most of these terms," my uncle said, "with a few adjustments." I reviewed their counterproposal in silence. They tried to soften the oversight, dilute accountability, keep just enough control to feel familiar. I closed the folder. "No," I said. One word. "Calm." Unemotional. The room froze. "This structure isn't negotiable," I continued. "Without it, the risk doesn't change. And without reduced risk, there's no deal." My cousin looked panicked. My uncle looked tired. Years had passed since anyone had spoken to him like that. Finally, he exhaled. "If we don't agree," he asked, "what happens?" I met his gaze. "Then nothing," I said. "And nothing is exactly what your situation can afford." Silence again. He nodded slowly. "We'll accept the terms." The words felt heavy, even to them. As signatures were placed on paper, something subtle shifted in the room. Authority didn't change hands loudly. It rarely does. It simply moves. They still didn't recognize me. Not yet. But they had just signed an agreement that placed their future firmly within my reach. And once that kind of control exists, the truth never stays hidden for long. The reveal didn't happen the way people imagine. There was no dramatic pause. No raised voice. No moment where I stood up and announced who I was. Truth doesn't need theatrics when timing is right. It happened weeks later, during a routine review meeting. The kind everyone attends out of obligation, expecting nothing more than numbers and projections. That's when the audit report came back. Independent. Verified. Unavoidable. The missing funds from years ago, the ones that had destroyed trust and rewritten my life, were finally traced. Not to a mistake. Not to an accident. To a name. A partner my uncle had trusted without question. A man who'd signed off on transactions no one had bothered to verify. The evidence was clean. Dates, accounts, intent. The room felt smaller as the report was read aloud. My cousin went pale. My uncle didn't move at all. I watched carefully. Not for guilt, but recognition. When my uncle finally looked up, his eyes met mine differently this time. Not as a partner. Not as an executive. As memory. His expression shifted slowly, like a door opening to a room he hadn't visited in years. "You," he said. I nodded once. Not in anger. Not in triumph. In confirmation. The silence stretched. No one interrupted it. No one needed to. "I didn't know," he said quietly. That sentence carried years of weight. "I know," I replied. That was the problem. There was no argument. No defense. The truth had already done its work. My cousin spoke next, his voice barely steady. "Why didn't you say something when we first met?" "Because it wouldn't have mattered," I said. "You wouldn't have listened. You needed proof, more than words." That landed. My uncle leaned back, suddenly older than I remembered. Authority drained from his posture, replaced by something closer to regret. "We were wrong," he said. Not an apology, but close enough. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't waiting for validation. I didn't need forgiveness. What mattered had already been secured: structure, control, protection. "I didn't come back for this," I finally said. "I came back because you needed help." The rest surfaced on its own. The meeting ended quietly. No accusations. No confrontation. Just the sound of papers being gathered and chairs moving away from a table that once decided my fate. As I walked out of the building, the weight I'd carried for years felt different. Not gone, resolved. They knew who I was now. But more importantly, they knew who I had become. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. No dramatic calls. No emotional confrontations. Just distance, the kind that settles in after something irreversible has been acknowledged. They didn't try to undo the deal. They couldn't. The structure we'd put in place worked exactly as it was meant to. Oversight tightened. Processes changed. Long-standing assumptions were replaced with verification. The company stabilized. Not because of forgiveness. Because accountability had finally arrived. My uncle kept his role, but the weight of it had changed. Authority no longer came from history or reputation. It came from compliance, from transparency, from answering to systems instead of expecting loyalty to fill the gaps. That adjustment was harder for him than any accusation ever could have been. My cousin reached out once. Just once. He didn't ask for favors. He didn't bring up the past directly. He simply said he hadn't understood what silence had cost. I didn't respond right away. Some conversations don't need to happen on a schedule. When I did reply, it was brief. Civil, closed. I wasn't reopening anything. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer lived there. The strangest part was how little satisfaction I felt. I'd imagined this moment so many times during the years I'd struggled. Thought justice would feel louder, warmer, more final. It didn't. It felt calm. Like closing a door you'd kept open just in case. Work continued. The project moved forward. Results followed structure, just as I'd expected. My role remained quiet, by design. Power works best when it doesn't need recognition. Occasionally, I caught my uncle watching me in meetings. Not with resentment, with something closer to caution. And maybe understanding. He never apologized outright. I never asked him to. We operated within the boundaries of professionalism, and those boundaries were enough. Because respect, I'd learned, doesn't come from being right. It comes from being necessary. One evening, I passed the old house. The lights were on. Curtains drawn. Life continuing inside without me. And for the first time, I felt no pull toward it. I hadn't returned to reclaim my place. I'd returned to outgrow it. The past hadn't been rewritten. It had been surpassed. And that, I realized, was the cleanest ending I could have asked for. Closure doesn't always arrive with an apology. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as routine, hidden in the realization that a chapter no longer has power over you. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Not easier, just clearer. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop measuring yourself against people who never truly saw you. The project succeeded. Not spectacularly. Not disastrously. It simply worked. And in the world I now lived in, that was the highest compliment. Stability meant the system held. Growth meant the structure could support it. They followed the rules. Because they had to. I remained involved, but never central. Decisions passed through me without needing my approval stamped loudly across them. Influence doesn't announce itself. It guides quietly, nudging outcomes before they ever reach a vote. Occasionally, my uncle tried to speak to me beyond work. A comment here, a question there. Not about the past, about the present. About how things should be handled. About risks he used to dismiss. I answered when it mattered. Not to teach him a lesson, but because lessons only stick when someone is ready to hear them. One afternoon, as we wrapped up a quarterly review, he paused at the door. "You've done well," he said. It wasn't praise. It wasn't regret, but it was acknowledgement. I nodded, and that was enough. I didn't stay to hear more. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt to be crossed safely. Some only need to be left standing behind you as proof that you survived the fall. On my way home that evening, I thought about the boy who'd walked out years ago carrying nothing but disbelief and pride. He had thought exile meant failure, that being pushed out meant being defeated. He hadn't understood then what I understand now. Exile creates distance. Distance creates perspective. And perspective creates power. I didn't win by returning stronger. I won by returning prepared. They once decided my worth in a single evening, without evidence, without care. This time, I didn't need their agreement. My position spoke for itself. I wasn't there to be accepted. I was there because they needed me, and that difference changed everything. The story didn't end with revenge. It ended with independence. With knowing that no table, no family, no authority could ever erase me again, not because I demanded recognition, but because I built something that couldn't be ignored. Sometimes, the best response to being cast out is to return only long enough to realize you no longer belong there at all. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. Not by erasing them, but by teaching you how to run your hand across them without bleeding. Months passed after everything settled. The company moved forward under its new structure. The people involved adapted, some faster than others. From the outside, it probably looked like a simple business recovery story. No one would ever guess what it cost. I rarely thought about that night anymore. The table, the silence, the door closing behind me. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it stopped controlling the narrative in my head. Memory changes when it no longer defines you. Occasionally, someone new at work would ask how I got here, where I started, what pushed me toward this path. They expected a clean story, a mentor, a lucky break. I usually kept it vague. Struggle doesn't always translate well to people who haven't lived it. What I didn't tell them was that the most important thing I gained wasn't skill or leverage or control. It was restraint. There were moments, quiet ones, where I could have pressed harder, taken more, exposed weaknesses publicly, forced apologies instead of allowing realizations to surface naturally. I chose not to, not because I was merciful, but because domination fades faster than discipline. Power that relies on humiliation is temporary. Power that relies on structure lasts. One evening, long after the workday ended, I found myself standing in an empty conference room, lights dimmed, city glowing outside the windows. The reflection staring back at me in the glass looked unfamiliar, not because I'd changed too much, but because I'd finally stopped carrying the version of myself that needed approval. That was the real return. Not to a family, not to a company, but to myself. I understood something then that I hadn't before. Being cast out wasn't the wound. Believing I needed to be let back in was. Once that belief died, everything else fell into place. Some people still assume this story is about revenge. It isn't. Revenge would have kept me tied to them emotionally, dependent on their reaction for closure. This was about sovereignty, about deciding my value without consensus, about walking away without bitterness because I no longer needed the past to validate the present. I don't know what they say about me now. I don't ask. It doesn't matter. What matters is this. When they erased me, they thought they were ending something. They were starting it. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of it, it's this. Sometimes the greatest advantage you'll ever have is being underestimated long enough to decide who you really want to become. There are moments in life that feel bigger while you're living them. This wasn't one of those moments. The lesson came quietly, long after everything else had settled. No confrontation. No dramatic realization. Just a simple understanding that arrived without asking permission. I was reviewing a new proposal when I caught myself smiling. Not because it was impressive, but because I recognized the pattern immediately. Overconfidence wrapped in polished language. Risk hidden behind reputation. A belief that history alone could guarantee the future. I closed the file. I'd seen this before. Years ago, I would have doubted myself, questioned my instincts, deferred to someone else's authority. That version of me wouldn't have trusted his own judgment. This one did. That's when it finally clicked. The real transformation had nothing to do with success or position. It was internal. I no longer needed someone else to confirm what I saw. I no longer waited for permission to trust my own analysis. Being erased had forced me to build something sturdier than approval. It had forced me to build conviction. I thought about my uncle then. About how certain he'd been that night at the table. How confident authority had made him. He hadn't been cruel, just careless with power. Carelessness looks harmless until it costs someone everything. That awareness stayed with me as I moved forward. In meetings. In decisions. In the way I treated people whose voices were easy to overlook. I made a rule for myself. Never dismiss someone simply because they're inconvenient. Never confuse silence for insignificance. Because I know what happens when you do. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory or a public reckoning. It ended with something better, control over my own direction. I didn't reclaim a seat at their table. I built my own. One where decisions were made carefully. Where trust was supported by verification. Where people weren't erased because it was easier than asking hard questions. And when I look back now, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. Being cast out didn't break me. It refined me. It showed me what power really is, not the ability to exclude, but the discipline to include wisely. Not the confidence to dominate, but the patience to prepare. Some stories end with revenge. This one ends with independence. And that lesson, the last one, is the only ending I ever needed. Some lessons don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with pain or victory or applause. They settle in quietly, shaping the way you move through the world long after the story itself feels finished. This was one of those lessons. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after everything resolved. Work remained demanding. Decisions still carried weight. Some nights were still restless. But the uncertainty that once followed me everywhere was gone. I trusted myself now. Not blindly, deliberately. I trusted the judgment built from being wrong, from being dismissed, from having to rebuild without anyone's permission. That kind of trust doesn't fade easily. Every so often, someone would mention my family in passing. A comment about their business recovering. A remark about how things seem different now. More disciplined. More careful. They were right. Not because of me personally, but because systems had replaced assumptions. And systems, unlike people, don't get offended by truth. I never rejoined the family. That chapter closed on its own. We existed in parallel now, professional when required, distant when not. No tension. No reconciliation scenes. Just boundaries that didn't need to be explained. And that was peace. I learned to recognize something important. You don't need to be understood by everyone to move forward. You only need to understand yourself. When I mentor younger colleagues now, I listen more than I speak. I pay attention to the ones who hesitate before answering, who see problems others overlook. I make space for them, not because I'm generous, but because I know what silence can hide. Potential. The world has a habit of mistaking loud confidence for competence. I don't. I've lived the cost of that mistake. Looking back, I don't resent the night I was cast out. I don't forgive it either. I simply accept it as the moment everything changed direction. Some doors don't close to punish you. They close to redirect you. If that door had stayed open, I might have remained comfortable, dependent, invisible to myself. Being pushed out forced me to build something internal that no one could take away. Perspective, discipline, self-respect. Those are things no family vote can erase. So when people ask what the story was really about, the exile, the return, the power shift, I don't talk about revenge or justice. I talk about becoming someone who doesn't need either. Because the strongest position you can ever hold is knowing that even if you lose everything again, you know exactly how to rebuild. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. Being rejected doesn't define you. What defines you is what you build when no one is watching. When I was cast out, I thought I'd lost everything, my place, my identity, my future. What I didn't realize was that I'd been handed something far more valuable. Distance. Distance from expectations I never chose. Distance from approval I was chasing without realizing it. Distance from a table where my worth could be voted on. That space forced me to listen to myself for the first time. To learn instead of react. To prepare instead of demand. To grow without needing permission. And when I returned, not to belong but to decide, the balance had already shifted. Not because I wanted power over anyone else, but because I'd finally taken responsibility for my own. Some people think the story ends when the wrong is exposed. It doesn't. It ends when the wrong no longer controls you. I didn't win because they admitted they were wrong. I won because I didn't need them to. I didn't return to be accepted. I returned prepared, and that made all the difference. So, if you're listening to this and you feel overlooked, dismissed, erased, remember this. Sometimes being pushed out is the beginning of becoming untouchable. Not louder, not crueler, just stronger, quieter, and impossible to ignore. And when you finally realize that, you stop trying to prove who you are because your position already says it for you.